Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. This is video number 2 in my review and response to the book by Paul Ellis entitled 8070 and the End of the World. I mentioned to you in our very first video that a great deal of Mr. Ellis's book, in his comments up through Matthew 24, 27 maybe, all right? He really has some great information that he has gleaned from the book of Josephus. Josephus, of course, was a Jewish historian who was alive, who witnessed the Jewish War of 66 to 70. He was initially a Jewish general in the Jewish army, but he was defeated by the Romans and became a chronicler of their invasion and destruction of Judea and Jerusalem. So anyway, Mr. Ellis really does an excellent job of gleaning some great quotes from Josephus, showing the beautiful fulfillment of Jesus' words. Now, it's kind of strange, and of course, this is perfectly allowable if the circumstances call for it. When Josephus talks about some of the things that he does, Mr. Ellis just flatly refuses and rejects that. On page 54, where Mr. Ellis says, citing Josephus, who said that God gave Jerusalem over to the Romans, Mr. Ellis says, did God give Jerusalem to the Romans? Was he an assistant to the enemy forces? We can take these words with a pinch of salt because Josephus was hardly an unbiased writer. When he wrote them, Titus was Caesar, and Josephus was hardly likely to portray his patron as a genocidal war criminal responsible for the deaths of 1 million non-combatants. No, Titus was a pawn in the hands of an angry God, an innocent agent of heaven's divine vengeance. Then he says, which just goes to show you that you shouldn't believe everything you read in history books. So on the one hand, Josephus is our key source for understanding the significance of the fall of Jerusalem and the Jewish war. On the other hand, you have to take what he says with a grain of salt, because after all, he said that God is the one that gave Jerusalem over to the Romans. Now, this is really, really a key element of Mr. Ellis's entire book. He flatly, categorically denies that the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 was a covenantal judgment against Israel for her violation of the law of Moses. Flatly rejects it. And he says, and he rejects, foundational to the preterist view is the idea that the law of Moses endured until AD 70. And he says the reason it's foundational to the preterist view is because the law had to be in effect for God to use the covenantal sanctions and covenantal penalties found in Torah to bear on Jerusalem. So he rejects that categorically. As we shall proceed, we shall see that this fundamental tenet of Mr. Ellis's view of the war is itself fundamentally flawed. Now, in the time for this morning, what I want to do is I want to focus on his discussion of Matthew chapter 24, 30, and 31, in which it says that immediately, verses 29 and following, in which it says, immediately after the tribulation of those days. Now, Mr. Ellis does a fine job of pointing out that the tribulation were the days of the war, leading up to and consummating in the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. And, again, does a good job on that. Well, okay, but then he cites Matthew 24, in which Jesus said, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun shall be darkened, the moon shall not give its light, the stars of heaven shall fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. Now, he's got a great discussion of that, by the way, that I would like 98%, maybe 99% agree with. But then when Jesus says, they shall see the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. All of a sudden, Mr. Ellis completely abandons his proper hermeneutic and proper exegesis. And he says this language of the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory is taken directly from Daniel chapter 7, 13 and 14. Well, I agree with that. But then he says, on page 67, top of the page, the Son of Man coming on the clouds phrase comes from Daniel, but it appears 6 times in the New Testament. Now listen to me very carefully. Each time it is mentioned in connection with Christ's ascension and exaltation. When we look at these 6 scriptures side by side, we find they share some common elements as shown in the table. And on the previous page, he gives us a table. Now, what's absolutely fascinating to me about this is that he completely omits Matthew 16, 27 and 28. The Son of Man shall come in the glory of the Father with his angels, and shall reward every man according as his work shall be. And verily I say unto you, there are some standing here which shall not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Now, does it mention the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven? No, it doesn't. But virtually every scholar that I have ever read agrees and asserts and affirms that in Matthew 16, 27 and 28, Jesus is alluding to directly, all but quoting from Daniel chapter 7, 13 and 14. So the question is raised, why would Mr. Ellis omit Matthew 16, 27 and 28? Well, the reason is simple. The reason is his claim that the Son of Man coming on the clouds phrase comes from Daniel, but it appears 6 times in the New Testament. Each time it is mentioned, it is in connection with Christ's ascension and exaltation. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is simply false. It is an egregious misuse of Daniel chapter 7. In Daniel chapter 7, Daniel saw in the days of the 4th empire, which is Rome, the arrival of the growth in power of the little horn, who would make war with the saints, and he would be destroyed at the setting of the judgment, which is the time of the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven. Now, how do I know that? Well, number one, the text tells me so. I mean, it's really quite simple. But if you have your Bible, I would hope that you would actually spend some time in Daniel chapter 7. And here's the reason why. It absolutely stuns me how people go to Daniel chapter 7, 12 and 13, and they rip it, divorce it away and out of its context. Well, once again, what is the context? The days of the 4th kingdom, the arrival of the little horn, the judgment of the little horn at the coming of the Son of Man. I'm sorry, folks, you cannot divorce it from that context. It's a judgment context. Now look, I used to believe that Daniel 7, 13 and 14 applied to the ascension of Christ in Acts chapter 1 until I actually honored the context of Daniel 7. And the context of Daniel 7 is the judgment. Now, here is something that amazes me, as I started to say a moment ago, and that is that in Daniel 7, 15 and following. Okay, so it's joined to verse 13 and 14. I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit within my body, and the visions of my head troubled me. I came near to one who stood by and asked him the truth of all of this. All of what? Days of the Fourth Empire, little horn, persecution of the saints, destruction of the little horn at the coming of the Son of Man. I wanted to understand all of it. So he told me, now listen to this very carefully. You have to catch the power of this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. So, Daniel 7, 1 to 14 is the vision. Not multiple visions of different times and different events. A single vision with different aspects of it, to be sure, but a single vision. Verse 15 through the end of the chapter, verse 28, is the interpretation of the vision. But you know what happens? Commentators come to the interpretation and they deny it. That's right, they deny it. Those great beasts which are four kings which shall arise out of the earth. Well, okay, Daniel saw a vision of the arrival of 4 kings, 4 beasts. The interpretation, those are 4 kings, 4 kingdoms. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever. Then I wish to know the truth about the 4th beast. Well, this is going back to the vision, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron, nails of bronze, which devoured, broke in pieces, and trampled the residue with its feet. And the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, before which 3 fell, namely, that horn which had eyes and a mouth which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. This is the little horn of Daniel 7, 10 through 12. You see, all of this is interpretation. Now watch, I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them. Well, okay, again, that's Daniel 7, 11, 12. It's the vision. This is the interpretation. I can't emphasize this too much. He made war with the saints until the Ancient of Days came. And a judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. Interpretation. 4 kingdoms, little horn, persecution, coming. Well, in Daniel 7, 13, and 14, it's the coming of the Son of Man. In Daniel chapter 7, verse 22, it's the Ancient of Days. And so commentators say, oh, well, the Ancient of Days, that has to be the Father. Verse 7, or verse 13 and 14, that's the Son. Well, wait a minute. In an internet debate that I had with William Vincent, he admitted that Revelation 1, 12 to 13, which is a vision of Christ, is in reality a vision of Christ as the Ancient of Days. He admitted that in our debate. Yes. Matter of fact, some translations actually refer to Christ coming as the Ancient of Days. Septuagint. So there is no break, there is no dichotomy between Daniel 7, 1 to 12 and verses 13 and 14. There is no division between the little horn arising, persecuting the saints, and his judgment at the coming of the Son of Man. Just as Daniel chapter 7, 21 and following, the little horn arises and persecutes the saints are given into his power until the coming of the Ancient of Days. Listen, folks, You gotta catch the power of this as well. Mr. Ellis is making a blatantly false claim here in regard to the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven. Let's do a chronological look at this. Mr. Ellis does a fine job of pointing out the chronological flow of the narrative of Matthew chapter 24, 4 to 29, through 29, okay? The arrival of false prophets, false teachers, famines, earthquakes, perils, etc., all occurred in the first century. The preaching of the gospel into all the world? Yep, it happened. The arrival of the abomination of desolation? Yep, it happened. Are you following me here? Are you catching the power of what Mr. Ellis is doing? He's going through the text of Matthew 24, 4 to 34, really. And he is documenting for us how Jesus' prophecy was fulfilled chronologically and in order. Okay, now then, what does he do? Matthew 24, 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days. Well, guess what that means, folks? And he chronicles this for us in a very good way by pointing out that the sun being dark and the moon being turned to blood, etc., was a description of the fall of the ruling authorities and the destruction of the temple. Okay, that followed, are you listening? The preaching of the gospel, the abomination, great tribulation, chronologically followed. But then he comes to verse 30, then shall they see the coming of the Son of Man on heaven, and he says, well, since it's the coming of Christ on the clouds of heaven, that is a reference to Jesus' ascension. What? That means that what you have Jesus saying is, okay, preaching the gospel, then the abomination, then the great tribulation, then the destruction of the temple. Oh, but wait. Verse 30, verse 31, verse 30. Now, it supposedly goes backward in time to the ascension. No. Notice the language. Then, immediately after the tribulation of those days is very clear. Immediately after the tribulation. Now watch. After the tribulation, verse 30, then the sign of the Son of Man who is in the heavens will appear, and then, now, when? Then the tribes of the earth shall mourn. When did the tribes of the earth mourn? Well, it wasn't at the ascension. It was not at the ascension. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming. When? When the tribes mourn. The tribes did not mourn at the cross. The tribes did not mourn at the ascension. The tribes did not mourn on Pentecost. Now, Mr. Ellis has to completely abandon his chronological narrative and the flow of events in order to get Matthew 24:30 as a reference to the ascension. And by the way, he has to completely ignore the judgment context of Daniel chapter 7 and the judgment context of Matthew 26:64. By the way, go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com, and I posted 5 articles there on Jesus before the Sanhedrin. It is an in-depth examination of Daniel 7, 13 and 14 as applied by Jesus, as interpreted by Jesus. But you see, in order to get Matthew 24:30 as a retrospective look backward to the ascension, Mr. Ellis has to ignore then. Oh, And he must make it say, then they will see the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. And then they will look backward to the ascension, which none of them ever saw. Just like the Sanhedrin never saw the ascension of Christ. And thus, when Mr. Ellis makes a huge point, a critical, a foundational, a fundamental point of claiming that the coming of Christ on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory is a retrospective look back at the ascension, he is ignoring the judgment context of Daniel 7, of Matthew 24:30, Matthew 26:64, Mark 13, Luke 21:27, and Revelation 1:7. And very quickly, notice Revelation 1:7. Behold, he comes with a cloud, and every eye shall see him, even those who pierced him. Who pierced him? The Jews. All the tribes of the earth shall mourn. What's the context? His coming on the clouds in judgment of those who pierced him. Every passage dealing with the coming of Christ on the clouds of heaven is a judgment context, completely and totally falsifying one of Mr. Paul Ellis's key fundamental claims. Listen, thank you so much for joining me for this morning's morning musings. I truly appreciate it. I hope you'll have a fantastic and safe weekend. I'll see you on Monday.